Hello everyone, this is Wes Henson, pastor of the Ridge Church. And the Ridge Church campus is located at 7350 Old Highway 13 in Carbondale, Illinois. And I want to thank you for joining me today as we give a quick on-the-go summary of this week's small group Bible study for the week of January the 9th, 2022. This week concludes our study, Irrefutable, Prophecies that Point Us to Jesus. So let's take a moment to review our 5 or 6 week study. Christmas, is a natural time for us to focus on the birth of Jesus. However, Jesus' birth is not just a Christmas story. It was prophesied centuries earlier. So let's take a look at our session titles. Week 1, we focused on God with us. The point of our lesson was that Jesus is Emmanuel, which means God with us. And we looked in Isaiah chapter 7 and Matthew chapter 1. Week 2, the focus was the light in the darkness. And the point of that lesson was that Jesus shines his light into a dark world. And the point of our third session was that Jesus came for our salvation. And let me just stop right there for a moment. The only reason why we celebrate Christmas and the only reason why Jesus came to the earth was so that we might have salvation, so that we might have our sins forgiven and an eternal relationship with God through Jesus Christ. Okay, session 4, our text was Isaiah chapter 9 and Luke chapter 1. And the point was that Jesus rules his kingdom now and forever. And then last week's session title was The Light and Glory of God. Jesus reveals God's glory and love. Okay, this week's title is The Ruler Who Cares for His People. And we'll be looking in Micah, Old Testament book of Micah, chapter 5, looking at verses 2 through 5, and then Matthew chapter 2, and we'll read several verses there, 1 through 6 and 9 through 11. If you click on the links, you will find a study guide, a summary of this week's lesson, along with a couple of handouts. And then join us on campus this Sunday morning at 9 a.m. or online Tuesday night at 6:30 on Facebook and our website as we go into detail. Okay, the point of this week's study is that Jesus leads and cares for his people. A little background here. Many Old Testament prophets and prophecies reflected on, 1, God's coming judgment. They also reflected on 2, promises of God to redeem and restore them. And a further topic that often accompanied the prophecies of the Old Testament prophets was that they reflected that the ultimate deliverance for God's people will come when the Messiah comes. And so Matthew tells us in the New Testament that Jesus came to fulfill these prophecies and to care for his people. Okay, let's look at our passage. Micah chapter 5, beginning in verse 2, and I'm going to read this passage from the New Living Translation, so follow along if you would. But you, O Bethlehem, Ephrathah, are only a small village among the people of Judah. Yet a ruler of Israel whose origins are in the distant past will come from you on my behalf. The people of Israel will be abandoned to their enemies until the woman in labor gives birth. Then at last his fellow countrymen will return from exile to their own land. Verse 4, and he will stand to lead his flock with the Lord's strength in the majesty of the name of the Lord his God. Then his people will live there undisturbed, for he will be highly honored around the world. And verse 5, the first part, and he will be the source of peace. Okay, so the truth here from Micah's passage is that Micah, Old Testament prophet, prophesied the coming king who would shepherd his people. Micah proclaimed God's message about the coming king. Specifically, he said the ruler would come from Bethlehem, Ephrathah. And that was in verse 2. And this hope and deliverance that Micah is forthtelling does not happen immediately. In fact, over 700 years would pass before this prophecy was fulfilled. And meanwhile, the Jews would undergo a season when Israel will be abandoned, as he points out in verse 3, because they were rebellious and sinful. And then this abandonment, though, would not be permanent. Because from among them would be born a ruler who, verse 4, would stand and shepherd them into the strength or in the strength of the Lord. So to stand here means that he will assume the role of king. He will also rule, in verse 4, in the majestic name of the Lord his God. And so here you see in the Old Testament prophecy this idea of judgment and restoration, and the time that it would happen is with the coming of the Messiah. Which brings us to Matthew chapter 2, and let's look at verses 1 through 6. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem, just as Micah had prophesied of Judea in the days of Herod the king, wise men from the east arrived in Jerusalem, saying, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star at its rising and have come to worship him." When King Herod heard this, he was deeply disturbed, and all of Jerusalem with him. So he assembled all the chief priests and the scribes of the people and asked them where the Messiah would be born. "In Bethlehem of Judea," they told him, "because this is what was written by the prophet. And you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judea, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, because out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." And here Matthew is quoting the passage in Micah. So the truth here is that the wise men were led to seek out the king. Now, the birth of Jesus was known only by a small group of people. When he was born, the angels announced to the shepherds, and there were the people, Mary and Joseph, and whoever the shepherds had told about the birth of Jesus. That was it. But all of that changed when the wise men arrived in Jerusalem, and they announced that they were looking for he who has been born King of the Jews. Now, their arrival caused King Herod and many of the ruling elite great concern. The question is, would they accept this miraculous child as the long-awaited Messiah and King of the Jews, or would they reject him? Jesus' position as the King of Kings, you see, demands a response from us as well. We either acknowledge his lordship and surrender to him, or we reject him. Okay, let's go on down to verse 9. After hearing the king, they went on their way, and there it was, the star that they had seen at its rising. It led them until it came and stopped above the place where the child was. And when they saw the star, they were overwhelmed with joy. Entering the house, they saw the child with Mary his mother, and falling to their knees, they worshipped him. And then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Our truth here is that a recognition of who Jesus is leads us to worship him. And I hope you hear that. When we recognize who Jesus is, then we fall down in worship of him. Then the wise men gave him lavish gifts, and these gifts certainly reflected the wise men's worship and devotion. And our response to the Messiah, to Jesus, must also be worship. Okay, here's some application. So our ultimate leader is Jesus, and when we choose to follow him, we discover that he leads us with love and care and grace. So how do we respond to the Lord's love and care and grace? Let me give you 3 applications. Number 1, trust him. Trust the shepherd. Trust Jesus to guide you with his care. Application number 2 is worship the shepherd. Spend some time this week listing the attributes of God. Just write them down, and then carve out some time to be alone and to worship him for the way that God has shown you his love. And then application number 3 is study. Study the shepherd. Find occurrences of the word shepherd throughout the Bible and read those passages. And how does this increase your understanding of the way Jesus cares for his people? All right, let's wrap it all up for this week. As our loving shepherd, Jesus shows his love and how he leads and cares for us. He is truly all that we need. And when we rest in him and surrender to his authority in our lives, we shall not want. Remember that Psalm 23, the Lord is my what? Shepherd, I shall not want. Okay, if you click on the links, you're going to find a study guide, a summary of this week's lesson, along with some handouts. And then join us on campus Sunday morning at 9 a.m., or online Tuesday night at 6:30 on Facebook or our website as we go into detail. Bye for now.